Hello and welcome, I'm Chris Hall and this is the Timeshift. It's the Doctor Who vlog thing that I do, if vlog is still a word that is used. I don't honestly know, I'm not terribly hip on technical jargon and internet YouTubey things. This is my little thing where I get to dissect this week's episode of Doctor Who, going into great detail on it and what I thought worked, didn't work, or if I thought the episode was fantastic or mind-gratingly terrible. Now, I should say here and now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, there is going to be spoilers aplenty. In order for me to talk in detail about some of the things that are right or wrong with this episode, I need to talk about spoilers. So if you do not for any way, shape or form want this episode to be spoilt, maybe you've got it recorded in your generic recording box, maybe you're going to watch this on the iPlayer, regardless of what form you're going to watch this in, if you do want to watch this without spoilers, then it's probably best to switch this video off right now. Maybe watch one of the many wonderful YouTube videos that are to my left. If it is, of course, you're watching this on YouTube, you may be watching this somewhere else, in whichever case it may well be something somewhere I don't honestly know. If you have anything you want to raise, any questions or queries, maybe you agree with something I say, maybe you disagree, maybe you just want something to ask me, then just leave it in the comment section below, because the comment section is always below. Whether or not there's videos to the left of me is a different matter, but anyway, I'm getting het up and confused in the idiosyncrasies of the different formats of different video sharing websites, which I shouldn't really do because it's not important. What is important is this week's episode, entitled Flatline. So basically the plot synopsis of this is that the Doctor and Clara are in the TARDIS. Clara is about to meet Mr. Pink, and then disaster strikes when a certain portion of energy is zapped directly from the TARDIS, causing it to shrink in size, almost a half size to what it originally was. However, everything within it remains pretty much the same size. It's dimension-y, tiny, spacey stuff, which I honestly don't understand, and to be honest, they didn't really go into great detail on it, so it doesn't really matter. Basically, it means that the Doctor has to try and figure out why his TARDIS is shrinking, but in order to do that, he has to be in the TARDIS, which means that Clara has to effectively be the Doctor for this episode, whilst the Doctor himself is in the TARDIS trying to fix and figure out what's going on, figure out why it's being shrunk down, and etc, etc. Of course, Clara and the Doctor soon discover that there is a range of mysterious disappearances going on in the council estate in which they've landed. What's behind it? What's going on? Well, if you watch the episode, you probably know. So, with the vaguest of vague outlines of the plot done, let us get into the dissection, shall we? Now, this week's episode I really liked. It's probably one of the best episodes I've seen in this series, which, yes, for many fans of Doctor Who, that sounds like a very odd thing to say, because naturally if you're a fan of Doctor Who, you're going to love every single episode, aren't you? Well, if you've seen some of my previous videos, you know I've not liked all of them. I think it's fair to say I've not liked many of them. Though with that said, I really like this episode. I state again, I really like this episode. It's written by the same gentleman who wrote last week's episode, which I really liked. I find it astounding, personally, that this is 2 episodes on the trot which I've really liked, so it must mean that this guy that wrote this week's and last week's is really good. And I look forward to see what else he does for Doctor Who. I don't know if he's written any more episodes for this series. Maybe he's written some for next series. I hope they're of the same quality, because I really like this episode. I say again, I really like this episode. Why did I like this episode? Well, it had a slightly old school kind of feel to it. And I mean old school in the classic Who sense, not old school as, you know, early David Tennant days or something like that. No, I think the kind of reason why it felt a little bit old school Doctor Who was because the big opening location in this week's episode was effectively an urban wasteland site, you know, just brown beltland, I think that's what they call it. Those bits in near train stations and disused junkyard looking areas, which pretty much made up the entirety of all the external locations in classic Doctor Who. So in that regard, it kind of got a little bit of a nostalgic twinge for me, which I really liked, and it kind of helped that my enjoyment of the episode to a certain degree, because it did feel old school, not just in the sense that it looked with the mini TARDIS a little bit cheap, because that kind of felt like a thing that old Doctor Who would do, in which we'd have an episode in which the TARDIS goes a little bit wonky, and that wonkiness turns out to be part of a bigger thing, and it happening in disused warehouses and stuff. But it also feels old school in the sense of new Doctor Who. It felt very much like an episode you probably would get in the first series of this run of Doctor Who. Definitely from the Christopher Eccleston era, in that it felt very much part of something familiar, something that we're all aware of. It takes place on a council estate. It's about graffiti to a certain degree. Granted, it's graffiti that wants to kill everyone, but still, it's stuff that we recognise. This isn't an episode set on Parthon Squip, and there's an evil spodunkrunk which eats people's toes, and the Doctor now has to negotiate with the Snarfs and the Snicks to unify them, to bring their love together to defeat the evil monster, which is what some episodes of Doctor Who certainly feel like. This is something very noticeable, something very familiar, and that added something to the episode itself. Graffiti in all its forms, good, bad or indifferent, is something we see in everyday life. So then you have this weird thing of, I wonder, is the Bob Was Here logo painted on the side of the bush shelter? Or is that trying to kill me? I know that I'm being a little bit facetious when I say that, but it's familiar. It reminds me of stuff in the real world, and they're doing something weird and strange with it. It's not quite a big, deep deconstruction of it. It's just, well, what would it be like if that picture of the weird alien man was actually a weird alien man who was trying to kill me, and from that we get this episode. And the episode itself, in terms of its writing, its composition, was really well paced. I like the fact that it wasn't a runny, pointy dun 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 episode as it really could have been. And I was kind of worrying it was due, because as soon as we got onto the council estate, I was starting, also, as well as the big happy nostalgic flashbacks, I was starting to have nostalgic flashbacks to Rose Tyler's time on Doctor Who and David Tennant, and the episodes in which the majority of the action in it was them running and pointing at stuff going dun 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 dun, which that wasn't the case. There was a genuine mystery and an intrigue towards this story, which we, the audience ourselves, were given plenty of time to try and dissect and to look at. And it turns out that quite a bit of what the story is about dissection and cutting stuff up and constructing it. There's this great moment midway through the episode, which if you've seen it, then you'll know what it means. It's when the policewoman gets sucked into the floor and suddenly have the mural on the back of the wall. Now, I've seen that little shot of Clara and the young man, I can't remember his name, just trying to figure out where what's happened to this policewoman, and you have the mural behind it. I didn't for 1 minute catch on that this was a human nervous system. So when the Doctor said that thing on the wall, it's a human nervous system, I went, oh my god, it's a human nervous system. That's brilliant. The special effects artists on this episode must have had a field day, because there's some really creative stuff going on inside it. And I love the fact that this is an episode in which the Doctor doesn't know exactly what's going on, because then it adds some genuine jeopardy to it. If this is something the Doctor knows about, it knows its ins and outs, then it's only really a matter of time before the Doctor figures out how to get its weak spot. Which, yeah, the Doctor does kind of figure out how to defeat them, but it's kind of a very last minute thing, and it's just really to round off the episode. It's not like, yes, this is the spodunk, and spodunks are allergic to sodium chloride. We have to find the nearest ocean and evaporate some water and throw it at it, and it will die, as it could well be. I know I'm getting a bit weird with this, but I just love this episode. I honestly did. It had a certain air of menace to it. It came very close to me actually being afraid of this week's episode, to being genuinely freaked out, which I don't think I've ever been with Doctor Who. Well, the closest I've been is in some of the classic episodes of Doctor Who, when there's stuff that was a little bit, are we sure this is still a family show? When this, I came very close to it. The idea that these things are dissecting people and just leaving the remnants of that in plain sight, hiding it in plain sight, and we're just thinking, oh well, that must be a mural of some weeds or something, and that's a picture of a desert, when it turns out that's a nervous system and that's a zoomed in look at someone's flesh. Then it gets really interesting. I really like this episode. It was well paced, well written. I love it. I genuinely did. Now, this week's episode did have some great casting within it. Of course, I don't remember any of the supporting cast's names, whether that be their real names or the characters they played, so I do apologise for that. And I think that's kind of in some regard, because as fantastic as they weren't as fantastic as last week, which I know it kind of feels like damning with faint praise, but last week was great for me. I say again that last week's episode, I think, didn't really need to be the Orient Express in space, because everyone looked of the era. Everyone looked as though they should be on some kind of Agatha Christie mystery Poirot program, and it felt very much of that kind of era. So the idea it was in space didn't need to be the case. You could quite easily just swap these same actors out to being in a real Murder on the Orient Express TV movie, and it wouldn't look at all odd. With this week's episode, as enjoyable as it was, it didn't have that same, I want to say, structure to it. People just kind of played the role as much as one could, because there's an oldish guy in the community service group who's just bitter and cantankerous, and that's all he is. It feels that some of the characters are just very ironically two-dimensional, and their entire motivation is to be the gruff old man or the naive, bright-eyed youngster, which, yes, they do very well, but in terms of depth to the character, it's not that great. Whereas the characters from last week, even if they were just there essentially to be killed off, which many of them were, let's be honest, there was still a bit of a more three-dimensional character to them, because they could be the very suave, sophisticated Egyptologist who's very measured and very prim and proper, but as soon as death comes a-knocking, he's panicking and, oh my god, don't kill me, I'll give you anything, I'll give you all your money, I shall worship you, and oh no, I'm dead. Whereas this week it was, some people just deserve to die. Oh, you young'un, we got to paint that stuff up because you're wronging you. Oh, blowy deck, I hate all this. Except with a Bristol accent. And that is something that did bug me, was the whole thing with the Bristol accent. I've been to Bristol, right? Not everybody in Bristol sounds like Wurzel Gummidge. Almost every other character in this was going, oh, right there, there's been quite a few disappearances going on around here. There's been loads of people walking about them mysteriously disappearing. But there's been loads of these murals appearing, and they're around the same time. It's really weird and actually rather strange. Almost everyone was like that, which I found very, very odd, because it feels as if you're watching the Wurzels, for Christ's sake. I know that people in Bristol and around the area do talk like that, but not so profoundly. I found it slightly farcical in a way. And given that some of the depth of the characters wasn't that much, it did kind of make it feel like you were in some kind of very, very warped, kind of very limp-wristed attempt at character development. I was going to say some kind of Wurzel Gummidge episode, but I've never seen Wurzel Gummidge, so I can't really talk about that. But it's kind of odd that some of the characters, it's just a case of, oh, right, I'm the policewoman, and there's been quite a few murders going around here, if you know what I mean. Oh, bloody hell, I'm being dragged down into the floor. Oh, crikey, somebody help me. With a very fakey accent, with a fairly fakey character, which, of course, I think it's kind of odd saying it for about her, because she was just literally introduced for a bit before to be killed off. But like with the old guy, his entire thing was, oh bloody hell, are all these kids these days are all wrong, and that's effective what they are for the entirety of the episode. I understand that some characters don't change, and some people don't change their motivation and their outlook on life regardless of certain things that happen to them, in that almost theatre of the absurd kind of way. But the fact that it extends so deeply into the very fabric of their character, there doesn't seem to be any kind of reflection of what's happened to them. Just a case of, oh, you're right, you're monsters trying to kill everybody. Whoa. Well, I better go home and talk to the missus then. Okay, it kind of feels like I'm starting to get onto a downer about the cast, which I'm not. I did enjoy them. It's just that it's hard to enjoy people and characters when they are just flat, who are Wurzel Gummidge kind of things, when they are just two-dimensional in such a way. Which is a shame, because it's a special effects driven episode. To get so hung up on the supporting cast, I think is silly. I admit, but that is in the grand scheme of things probably where the main weakness lies, in that certain characters, which yes they were important to it, and they were just there either to get killed off or just to make up the numbers, weren't that good. Which, considering that some of the people introduced last week to either be killed off or just to make the numbers, did a better job. And I know I shouldn't be comparing episodes, because each episode is good and bad for its own reasons, but it feels odd, particularly when you consider that this episode is written by the same person that wrote last week, so you'd expect the character development to be more or less the same. Of course, you may disagree with me, once again, in the comment section below if you disagree or disagree. But still, going back to the characters, and I know I shouldn't linger on this too much because I've still got some more stuff to talk about. I thought the guy playing the young lad, which I forget the name of, it's something like Gareth or Gazri. He had his real name, and then he had some kind of street art tag name, graffiti tag kind of name. I can't remember either of them. And I know what I'm going to say next sounds incredibly peculiar, seeing as I can't remember his name. I really enjoyed him. I was kind of hoping, much like Frank Skinner's character last week, that he would become a companion. I hope that we see more of him, because I really liked him. And, you know, seeing as it suggested, at least, that Clara is not long for her time in the TARDIS, having him on it might not be such a bad thing. I hope that we see more of him, because I found him to be an interesting character in his own little way. He was a local Ute. He was very much a very chavvy guy, probably a bit cocky in some of his attitudes, so maybe his time in the TARDIS would help him grow and develop as a young adult, which itself is then interesting in terms of writing and story, that we have a character who at the start of it may be a bit cocksure and a bit of a lad, then towards the end of it matures and becomes a grown-up, which itself would be an interesting thing. Chances are we'll never see him ever again. Probably the only passing reference we'll get to in a future episode will be something like, oh, this is a famous mural by the great, whatever the name the lad is, and oh yes, it's a brilliant work of art, isn't it masterful? And there'll be like a knowing nod towards the audience, like, haha, like that young lad that we saw a few episodes ago that everyone thought was a waste of space and wouldn't amount to anything. He became a world famous artist, kind of like Banksy in a way. So yeah, casting, bar the fact that some of the characters themselves in their construction was a bit two-dimensional, as a whole really enjoyed the casting of it. I know I'm not going to get into detail about Clara and the Doctor in terms of performance, because I'm sick and tired of saying that they're good. I honestly am. I think saying that Peter Capaldi is good as Doctor Who just needs to be a rule now. That anyone that does these videos, anyone talks about it, can't say that Peter Capaldi is good as Doctor Who, because it's no new news, to be honest. And of course some people use that as an excuse to not dislike certain episodes because Peter Capaldi was good in it, when it's his job to be good in it. For him not to be good in an episode would be something worth talking about. He's good in this. Fantastic. I think I've lingered on this a bit too long, so let us move on, shall we? I was incredibly apprehensive going into this week's episode, I have to say, particularly in regards to special effects, because this is an effects-driven episode. As much as I enjoyed the story and the characters, blah de blah de blah, this is an episode which is about its special effects. And, well, let's be honest, let us be very brutally honest for one moment about Doctor Who. CGI in Doctor Who is fairly crap, if we're honest about it. The effects in a lot of the episodes does look very cheap. The practical stuff looks great and is suitable and is solid. The CGI stuff more often than not looks very, very cheap, which in some ways kind of feels ironic given that in the past we had special effects made of tin cans and bubble wrap. It looked terrible but was functional. Now we have fairly limp looking CGI, which is terrible but functional. And the fact that this episode looked as if it was going to be CGI heavy and was CGI and special effect heavy, I did worry that it was going to look particularly ropey. Luckily it didn't, mostly because we don't see as much CGI as there really is. It's left very, very subtly. Like, we don't see the actual two-dimensional CGI monsters towards the end of the episode, and then the lighting's very dark, and they kind of explain why they move so jerkily and look so odd, because the two-dimensional entities entering a 3D space, and even then the design of them being in the 3D space looked fantastic in my humble opinion. And when we see people getting flattened and two-dimensionalized, it's often to do with perspective more than anything else, and to a certain degree you could probably have gotten away with some of the flattening death moments with them just being painted and airbrushed onto a wall than necessarily them being done with CGI. In any case, looked fantastic. No, actually, no, I was going to say a negative thing, but there isn't anything negative about it, because it did look fantastic. I was trying to think of one moment in which the CGI looked ropey, and it didn't really, because it just showed you enough. It showed you enough of the woman getting pulled down into the floor. It showed you enough of the sofas being flattened, or the CGI three-dimensional, two-dimensional monsters running around along the train track. Everything was just so, and everything was very measured in that regard. There was a little difficulty, a little badness in terms of the CGI when we got on the bits when we were looking at the Doctor through the mini TARDIS. Whenever the Doctor went up to the TARDIS doors, seeing as he's the same size, but the TARDIS doors and the TARDIS itself is smaller, when he was talking to Clara through the TARDIS, the actual effect of that looked very bad, it has to be said. Which was the only bad effect within it. And towards the end of the episode, when we have the Doctor having to move the TARDIS by hand, I'm glad that was done for comedy purposes, because had that been done as a serious thing, that would probably have been a dumb moment of the episode. And given just we've only got the one dumb moment lifeline left on this little vlogcast before I start watching Doctor Who ever again, I think is a very, very good thing. There was a kind of odd thing though, and I know it's not really a special effects thing, it's more of a continuity thing, but the Doctor's haircut changed about halfway through. It went from the kind of very voluminous, I think that's the right word or whatever, kind of very uppity one, to being fairly flat towards the end of the episode, which I found very odd, because it went from looking like the wild-haired mad Doctor that we've had to being fairly flat, as though he's just had a bucket of water thrown on him. One could argue that's because of the flatness stuff, but it isn't. It's because he had to do some filming for a movie. I think it's for the Paddington Bear movie, which I think he's in, and he had to have a haircut, or he had a haircut around that same time. Then he came back to do these scenes, and naturally, I realistically weren't going to put him in a wig, because that would look incredibly bizarre, and they weren't going to do the thing that they did with Tom Baker when he got sick during filming one point. I just gave him a perm to try and perk his hair up, which looked even more ridiculous than the hair he had at the time. So that in itself looked very bizarre, and it was kind of distracting. Not as distracting as the CGI when he was trying to look at the TARDIS, but still, it was a very odd point. It probably is the only genuinely negative that I have for this episode. Episode as a whole, like I say, I really enjoy the odd naggle here and there, the fact that some of the characters were a bit two-dimensional, ironically enough, the fact that some of the special effects, well, not some, just the one special effect really of the Doctor talking through the TARDIS doors looked a bit peculiar. As a whole, great episode. Okay, so it kind of feels odd me having the overview bit right now, seeing as I've just said that I really like this episode and I like pretty much every aspect of it, bar the odd little bit here and there, but that was forgivably bad. I really enjoyed this episode once again. I really enjoyed this episode. You can kind of guess that I found it very difficult to talk about this week's episode because I enjoyed it that much. It's very, very easy for me to talk about episodes I don't like, because I can just rant and rave at just how horrible they are. With episodes I really do like, it's a little bit more difficult because it being good is self-explanatory, and many people I've talked about this week's episode of Doctor Who really liked it. Needless to say, I really liked it. I'm not going to say I really liked it anymore because I'm going to sound like a broken record. One thing I would like to pick up on within the episode itself, towards the end of the episode, when Clara, because of the Doctor, when Clara is talking to the Doctor and says, "Wasn't I a great Doctor?" And we have the little exchange between them of whether or not Clara was a great Doctor. you kind of get this feeling on the Doctor's part that the Doctor's a little bit concerned for Clara and the kind of the direction that she's taking as being a companion and the influence that he may have had on her recently, in particular in the Moon episode, which will not be named. So I think that kind of does hint towards where we're going with this series, whether or not Clara will leave at the end of this series or towards the Christmas one has been hinted here and there. It kind of hints as to how she might leave it. More that, well, towards the beginning of this series, Clara was a little bit worried because the man that she once knew as the Doctor was gone and was replaced by somebody else in a kind of inverted way. The Doctor is getting a little bit seemingly concerned about his companion not being the same person that he first met. So, in a weird way, it kind of works and is enjoyable. And I'm interested to see where they go with this and whether or not that itself will tie into the Promised Land story arc. As finally, after 2 episodes of absence, we have a reference back to the Paradise thing, the Promised Land story arc, which we've been desperately needing. The fact that we've not had any reference to it for the past 2 episodes, at least not in a way which is so explicit, was a little bit concerning, at least on my part, because if it's not an explicit reference, like we have the very odd epilogue moments, which I'm a bit iffy on, it means that the way they're going to tie it into the Promised Land story arc is going to be very tenuous and very laboured, which I do worry about, particularly when we get to the guest written episodes, that we are going to have a bit of, oh yeah, the reference in this episode was because on one of the computers there was a symbol which up until now had no meaning or relevance to anything, but it does now. As is sometimes the case, one of the worst cases of retrofitting a story into a greater story arc was a few series ago, when we had the pirates on the spaceship episode. It was the Pirates Mermaidy one with Catherine Jenkins or something like that. It was one of the killer mermaids, and he had the pirates. And at the end of the episode, the pirates went off in a spaceship. Then at the end of that series, we saw the pirates back on the spaceship, helping the Doctor do whatever it was doing. They didn't say anything, they just looked out the window and went, which was just horrible. Oh, and we also in that episode also had this Spitfires in space again, just jumped through time, then jumped back because we need references. But anyway, I'm getting a bit carried away here. I don't think there's anything else for me to say because I really like this episode. I really like the young lad that was in this episode. Can't remember his name, Gavin or Gray. I really liked him. Hope we see more of him. We probably won't do. Well, it depends whether the Peter fella who wrote this episode becomes the show's front runner, which I wouldn't be offended if he did, given that his track record of the past couple episodes has been fantastic. Though that said, Stephen Moffat's track record before he became the front runner of the series was fantastic, and subsequently he's written some terrible episodes, so whatever. Next week's episode is trees. Trees everywhere. And some kind of reference to Little Red Riding Hood. Well, it could be interesting. Maybe. I don't know. It's got loads of little children actors in it, and I've got a feeling this could be an episode I get really angry at. But it's the last, I think it's the last episode before we get into the end of series 2-parter. So, I'm apprehensive to the extreme. But it could be fantastic. Bearing in mind, I thought that the Robin Hood episode was going to be crap and it was good. And I thought the Mummy on the Orient Express episode was going to be bad, but it turned out to be good. And I thought this episode was going to be bad, but it turned out to be good. I thought the Kill the Moon episode was going to be horrendous, and I was right. I was wrong, because it was even worse than horrendous. So, we'll soon see. I really hope the next week's episode isn't apocalyptically bad, but we'll see. Let's have a bet. Let's have a bet here and now. without actually betting any money, because I realise I have no money which to bet with, let's just say, as a prediction, I bet next week's episode is going to have an environmental tilt towards it. I bet that's going to be the moral of next week's episode, is about, oh, don't destroy the forest, don't destroy the green belt land, or something like that. Which, serious issue, we won't get into that. But still, I guarantee you that next week's episode is going to have a environmental tilt to it. And I'm going to remember this bit in the video, so that next week, I shall introduce the episode with this bit. And we'll see whether or not I was right. I may be wrong, but I may also be right. And if I am, I have no words. So anyway, that was my look at Doctor Who. I think it's probably been needlessly long. I do apologise for that, but I do get carried away sometimes. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or anything you want to raise, then just leave it in the comment section. Fantastic. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.